The information and opinions presented in this ARC Energy Ideas podcast are provided for informational purposes only and are subject to the disclaimer link in the show notes.
This is the ARC Energy Ideas podcast with Peter Tertzakian and Jackie Forrest, exploring trends that influence the energy business.
Welcome to the ARC Energy Ideas podcast. I'm Jackie Forrest.
And I'm Peter Tertzakian. Well, it is 2023, Jackie, and I was just sort of reflecting. We started the podcast in 2019, so we're into the fourth year of the podcast. Isn't that amazing?
It really is amazing. It has flown by, and so much has happened, right?
So much has happened. And with this podcast, I mean, our geographic reach has really expanded.
Yeah,
we have listeners. We were sort of checking the geography all the way from Argentina, Qatar, Singapore, all the way around the world. So we're very grateful to all of our listeners and welcome to our international audience. Here in Canada, we have fairly broad representation too. We have listeners all the way from coast to coast. And we have listeners in Quebec as well, even though we're not a French language podcast.
Yes, yeah. And because of that, I think it's good to talk a little bit more about what's going on in Quebec.
And on that note, we are delighted to have someone that I met last year at a conference with an organization called Energica that moderated several forums. And at those forums, I met Monsieur Yvan Cliche, who is our guest today. Bonjour, Yvan.
Bonjour.
Welcome. And so, Yvan, you're a fellow at CERIUM, which is the Center for International Studies and Research at Université de Montreal. I hope I said that in my proper French. And you've worked at Hydro-Quebec until 2018. You've held positions as an international project manager, a power purchase agreements contracts manager, and other things. But more importantly, in 2020, you joined the Université de Montreal as fellow and researcher in energy and written several books on international matters and energy. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me to your program. It's a real pleasure. I'm a regular and faithful listener to your podcast.
Great. Well, one of those followers in Quebec, we're going to try to grow the Quebec followers. So thanks for your support. Now, you recently wrote a book, and it's in French, and I'm not going to even try. My French is not nearly as good as Peter.
Do you want me to try?
All right,
okay,
Peter,
so
you could try.
Yvan, you can quality control my French. Jusqu'à plus soif, pétrole, gaz solaire, éolien, enjeux et conflits énergétiques, which...
That's right.
When loosely translated by actually Google Translate into French, is until no longer thirsty, oil and gas, solar, wind power, energy issues and conflicts.
Yes, I just published this book. It was published last October. I've written many op-eds since becoming a researcher at the Université de Montreal, and I decided in 2021, to go for bigger projects, a book on the geopolitics of energy, oil, gas, and renewables.
Okay, well, we're going to talk more about your book, but today we're going to structure the discussion into three areas. We're going to talk generally about energy, talk more about Canada, and then switch to talking about the energy situation in Quebec.
Yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background? I gave a little bit of a teaser at the beginning with our audience, but tell us about your time at Hydro-Quebec and what you do at CERIUM.
Yeah, I worked at Hydro-Quebec, basically promoting the company's expertise worldwide in the generation and transmission of electricity and managing services contracts between Hydro-Quebec and the World Bank and sisters and institutions, and also representing Hydro-Quebec at international energy organizations like the World Energy Council, the International Hydropower Association, and the Global Sustainable Electricity Partnership. And these positions provided me with a unique opportunity for learning more about energy from an international perspective. So after my career at Hydro, I joined the Université de Montreal as a fellow and researcher in the energy sector. And as I've mentioned, I've started writing op-eds for various media and decided in 2021 to go for a bigger project. A book on geopolitics of energy was published in October last year.
What do you think about the U.S. move and the Western world's move to renewables and the aggressive attempt to lessen the dependence on oil and gas, even notwithstanding the situation in Ukraine? Do you think we're going to see a rapid decline in oil consumption like some predict?
Look, the end of oil has been predicted for a long time, so I will certainly not try to put a date to the end of oil consumption. From my perspective, with any data indicating a push away from oil and gas, you also see in other data indicating how much reliant we still are on oil and gas. I've done some presentations over the last few weeks on my book, and I reminded people that when I started working at Hydro-Quebec, oil and gas represented more than 80% of the energy mix worldwide. 30 years, 3 decades after my career, it still is more than 80%. We're still relying on oil and gas for more than 80% to cover our energy needs. But however, this being said, obviously, over the last 10 years, a new era has been opened in the energy sector. For ecologists back 10 years ago, there was no really sound solutions to move away from oil and gas because the prices of wind and solar panels were way too high. The technology was not sufficient enough. But now those people will go to politicians, now have really a concrete solution to hand over policymakers. Wind and solar panel have decreased in cost, as you know, tremendously over the last 10 years. So now we have solutions to move away from oil and gas. But again, this transition will be slow. I think it's picking up. I think it's picking up, especially in Europe and in the Western world. It's slower in developing nations, but obviously the trend is there. And I think the debate now is around the pace of the transition. We still don't know yet if it's going to be fast or it's going to take decades to come.
Yeah, that is the big question, the pace. I think everyone knows the direction of travel. Now, in your book, you talked about the trilemma of energy, that security of supply, affordability, and limited environmental impact is the goal. And we've been calling it cheap, clean, safe, and secure energy, which kind of has the same trilemma there. But today, because of what's going on in the world, do you think that this move towards caring about security, affordability is going to slow down or speed up the pace of transition?
I see the trilemma as a sequence. I've covered it in my book. At first, oil became an industry more than 150 years ago. The priority was set on securing enough supply to feed the world more and more dependent on energy, in fact, oil, to win wars and to feed a growing modern economy. But 2022 was a landmark year because environmental impacts have taken the back seat with energy security back to the top. It will stay like this for a long time. All countries have taken notes about the vulnerabilities created by being too dependent on others for your energy supplies. Affordability stays central, as we see in Europe, where governments have already spent billions of dollars to lower the impacts of energy prices increase on industry and households. But again, energy security is back on top of the trilemma for many years to come.
Well, your comment that energy security will effectively dominate the conversation ahead of environmental issues would lead some environmental groups to bristle, I would say. Having said that, though, my review of history, like we share the same passion of trying to understand the dynamics of energy in the context of geopolitics and so on, is that actually energy security drives transition faster than environmental degradation, because there's sort of this strategic imperative to shift off of one energy paradigm onto another one that is more secure for society. And in this case, that is aligned with environmental goals as well, the shift to renewables. How do you view that?
Yeah, I think you're right. You're basically right. Renewables are local. All countries have sun. All countries have wind. So in terms of moving ahead to renewables, it will obviously be a factor playing positively in terms of securing your energy position. But at the same time, as you know, the move to renewables is highly dependent on minerals. So what we see is that we also are reliant on China for securing minerals. As you know, China dominates the refining sector of critical minerals for over 80% of worldwide supplies. So this is also a major geopolitical issue that is taken up front by a Western government. And there's been, over the last 2 or 3 years, several initiatives taken by governments to break or wither from their dependence from China. So yes, we are targeting more and more energy security, but at the same time, being reliant on a few countries' exports for minerals is also a new issue that needs to be tackled on by governments.
Right. Well, Yvan, I think there's just much more recognition of that strategic weakness that we have with some of these programs, the IRA, which is going to incent more manufacturing in North America and even in Canada, the fall economic update promised some incentives to bring more manufacturing here. But you're right, when it comes to clean energy, we're probably got more of an energy security issue than we do with oil because it's more concentrated.
Yeah, we'll have to see what the push to seek vital mineral resources, as Yvan said, will do. Like, there's the same environmental surface rights issues, indigenous issues, and all sorts of things with things like whether it's cobalt, nickel, you name it, and even these vital lithium, these sort of vital minerals that are needed for the renewable revolution. And the desire to push for energy security to access those minerals more domestically. We'll have to see if the rules and regulations and all the issues are going to be relaxed as a consequence.
Right. Yeah. Back to my article that I wrote at the end of last year, arguing that we have to do things a lot faster if we're going to achieve some of these clean and green energy goals. Okay, well, let's switch to Canada. Let's talk about Canada's role in terms of the security dimension. A lot of people maybe don't appreciate that our oil production is very significant in the world, and that we are about 20% of all of NATO countries' consumption if you just look at our production. Not very often is it looked at that way, but in times of war like we are today, where you get your oil from and are those secure sources of supply becomes very important. Now, in this world of a very tight oil market in general, even small curtailments of production can have some pretty big consequences in terms of what's going on in Europe and Russia. But at the same time, we've got our federal government focused here on greenhouse gas emissions and talking about things like putting a cap on the production of oil and gas if we don't achieve our emissions reduction goals of something like over 40% by 2030. Do you think that something like a cap on oil and gas makes any sense in this world?
I'll start by saying that 2022 is a lost opportunity for Canada in terms of supporting allies in such a huge crisis. We have key energy resources, but with no quote-unquote geopolitical benefits. From my perspective, in 2022, we have seen more clearly the gap between us and the US in terms of capacities to develop our natural resources is use them externally for financial benefits and geopolitical influence. As you know, in only 7 years, from 2015 to 2022, the US came from zero exports of LNG to number one position as an LNG exporter. To come back to your question, my perspective is that the emphasis from government should be on curbing demand, not supply. Because doing so, companies reduce their needed investments and it creates supply shortages that contribute to higher energy prices. What I often said during my presentations is that it's a pity that we cannot build a better consensus in this country for an approach about the use of our oil and gas resources with a plan based on an assumption that oil consumption will decline in time. But for the next decades or so, Canada should take advantage of its position as a world producer financially and geopolitically. This is the approach privileged by the Norwegians, by the way, and we should be inspired by it.
Yeah, I agree. The Norwegians have been able to balance the idea of managing their demand, being much more efficient with it, yet at the same time being a meaningful contributor to Western supply sources of their oil and gas. You say in your book, on this point, you say in the book, oil has a very big drawback. It is geographically concentrated. It is not available everywhere in all countries. And on one hand, that leads to the riskiness geopolitically of the vital commodity because most of the oil is concentrated in countries that are not, have historically been outright hostile to Western interests. Yet if we flip it around, and further to your point, Jackie, that Canada supplies 20% of NATO's oil needs, which is hugely significant, we can turn that drawback into a positive. And I think that's what you're getting at, Yvan, is that, this is a missed opportunity, is that we can be viewed as a major constructive supplier of energy to the interests. Because at the end of the day, we can't be naive about this. We are in a proxy war with the Russians. Vladimir Putin has said that. I'm a child of the Cold War, as I like to say in many of these podcasts, so I remember what it was like back then. And there's no question in my mind, we are in conflict with the Russians, and we can't be naive to that. And we have to acknowledge that Canada is a major supplier of a vital military strategic commodity at this time because we can't transition to alternative forms of energy at a pace that meets our needs in the here and the now.
Yeah, you're totally right. As far as Alberta is concerned, two things come to my mind is lack of access to the sea, hindering Alberta oil and gas industry to enjoy all the financial benefits it could draw from selling its energy to countries other than the US. And for Canada, this landlocked situation is also a lost opportunity for increased geopolitical influence in world affairs, especially in times of crisis such as now.
Well, on that point, one of the reasons that we don't access the Tidewater is different provinces have different views on that. And Energy East was a big project that was going to enable Canadian oil to get out to the East Coast. If that had happened, that would be a real benefit to the world today. So tell us, what do people in Quebec really think about Alberta? I think during that debate around Energy East, the message here in the West was that, Quebecers are not going to ever support a pipeline for oil, especially, the oil sands. So what are their views on the oil sands and the potential for a pipeline?
Concerning Alberta, I will tell you an interesting story. I think we should differentiate between loud voices and average Quebecer. Back a year ago, I wrote an op-ed with the following excerpt, more or less. So I opened the quotes here. Some of our political elites in Quebec have scolded the dirty oil of Alberta. However, Quebec imports its crude oil from Western Canada for almost half of its consumption. We wisely bet in Quebec on hydroelectricity because our rivers were the main natural resources that we could harness in our territory. And Albertans have done the same, i.e. developed a local resource, in their case hydrocarbons. This wealth has generated significant equalization transfers to Canada from which Quebecers have largely benefited. This should encourage us to remain modest, to appreciate the fact that geography has smiled on us greatly. End of quote. Look, to my surprise, I must admit, this opinion received a lot of support in the social media from fellow Quebecers, much more than other comments I have published so far. So I think that there's also the fact that Albertans have not that much come to Quebec to explain the financial and geopolitical advantages of selling their products abroad. And there's also another reason. Look, as for oil and gas, the situation in Canada is very different compared to the US. In the US, there's more than 30 states are more or less involved in the oil business compared to only a few provinces in Canada. So there's less common ground in support of the oil and gas industry among Canadians.
Okay, well, hopefully we can, through this podcast and others, get more followers to get more common ground. I do have a question on LNG. So this Energy Saguenay project was going to be about a 1.4 BCF per day LNG export facility in Quebec, and it was rejected by Ottawa just before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia last year. Do you think that people would look differently at this project now when we know Europe needs gas and they're making deals with Qatar and the United States? Do you think people would think differently?
The Saguenay project was presented 2 years ago in a very different context compared to today. With the 2022 energy crisis, we can suspect that people in Quebec would be much more aware about the importance of energy security and the opportunity provided by the crisis in Europe. However, 20 years ago, there was high unemployment in Quebec, and Quebec was striving for foreign investment, outside investments, bringing lots of good jobs, especially in regions. And there was less awareness, obviously, 20 years ago about climate change. The situation is the opposite today. Quebec is a sought-after place for many industries looking for clean electricity. The province does not lack potentials in terms of significant foreign investments. Unemployment is at its lowest level, and there is increased sensitivity about climate change. So all this represents strong headwinds against this project, gathering enough support for approval. Furthermore, most politicians in Quebec, even pro-business ones, will not dare spend political capital for a controversial project, while many others, hydrogen or so, are striving to get the go-ahead.
Yeah, so you're saying probably pretty low probability even today based on the fact that Quebec is doing well economically. And you're right, it is a political issue that politicians will definitely face controversy for if they were to support it, I guess.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not overly optimistic that that project will go ahead. But let's go back to energy security in Quebec, because in your book, Yvan, you talk about how Quebec is vulnerable to the geopolitics of energy, even though there's sort of this feeling in Quebec that you're insulated from the geopolitics of energy because of Hydro-Quebec and the electricity that it provides. I think it's like 99% of the electricity comes from Hydro-Quebec. But that there is vulnerability in mobility because, of course, we have to move around goods in diesel-powered trucks and so on. Talk about the vulnerabilities of Quebec that you talk about in your book and how people think about it there.
If we see things in 2023, if we see things from the quote-unquote French shoring angle, a new popular concept, we are in a good place with Canada and the US being our suppliers for oil and gas. A few years ago, we were reliant on countries like Venezuela, but the situation has completely changed over the last 5-6 years. And we are fully reliant on our resources for electricity. So I think that like many Canadian provinces, we're in a good place in terms of energy security now in 2023. In its Trilemma Index, the World Energy Council places Canada in the top spot in terms of energy security. This index measures a country's ability to meet current and future energy demand, its ability to withstand supply shocks. So many countries in Europe will envy our privileged position.
Mm-hmm. But, we've talked about it on this program that I'm a little bit surprised by that Trilemma Index because so much of our oil, even to get to Quebec, has to transit through the United States and come back. And we never really know, in my opinion, at least, what the United States is thinking.
Yeah, you're right. And we've seen it with the Trump administrations of, we were under the assumption in Canada that our position was secure in terms of trading with the US when we've seen what we've went through, having to renegotiate the trade agreements with the US. So also with Line 5, I remember one of your podcasts, you mentioned that there was a decision to go to the US, and we would be obviously very much fortunate today if we have taken a different decision at the time to have Line 5 go only through Canadian territory. So I also agree with the fact that we're never totally secure. It will be probably much more in a secure position if we were to be provided from Canada for our oil and gas needs. But at the same time, if you compare circumstances with other countries like Venezuela, it's obviously more secure for Quebecers to get their oil and gas from Canada and the US compared to countries like Saudi Arabia or Latin American countries.
Now, I want to come back to this idea that Quebecers are very energy secure because of their large and abundant source of hydropower. And I think that's true today, but we know things are changing. We know that the demand for electricity is going to go up significantly if we electrify transportation and heating. I know a lot of heating is electrified in Quebec, but if we even electrify more. And, we did learn that Hydro-Quebec is actually looking to secure some renewable energy, wind and solar. They put out some procurements for that. So do you think that Quebec can continue to meet all its own needs when you consider the ramp up of demand that we're going to be seeing over the coming decades?
Interesting questions. There are new paradigms for energy and hydropower in Quebec. Hydro-Quebec needs to develop additional capacity of 100 terawatt-hour of electricity until 2050 to decarbonize Quebec's economy from a current generation of 200 terawatt-hours. So it's 50% more clean energy. For hydropower, we will need to secure support from local communities, including natives. And we all know that this is a much more difficult endeavor today compared to the past. Hydro projects will also come at higher costs, which is normal, by the way, since least costly projects have already been developed. The province also has ambitions to sell electricity to neighboring provinces and U.S. states in support of their decarbonization objectives. On top, as mentioned, many industries strive for an extra presence or presence in Quebec because of our clean and reliable electricity. But hydro projects take a very long time to be commissioned. So all of this must be carefully balanced to develop capacity that makes sense economically while taking long-term environmental concerns into account.
So do you think it's possible that they can grow their production considering all that? And I will add another thing. Climate change, is that going to somehow affect the amount of hydroelectricity that can be generated? We've seen that in other parts of North America this year where drought has resulted in less hydropower production.
Yeah, and because of that, now there's talk in Quebec that we must save our electricity as much as possible. The fact that the prices are low is a factor in the efficiency of use of our electricity. So there will be discussions years ahead in Quebec about the prices of electricity, the use of electricity. We all know now, and this is really a recent change. We all know now that clean electricity will come more sparsely and that we will need to use it much more intelligently than in the past.
Yeah, that's interesting because definitely low energy prices in a jurisdiction is a competitive advantage for many companies, right? And that's huge. So talk about the push to export electricity to the east coast of the United States into Massachusetts and the problems that there's been blockades of those sorts of hydro projects.
What we have seen in the U.S., Hydro-Quebec exports to the U.S. is one interesting example of how the transition can become really complicated. We all know that the energy transition is a transition to electricity, to clean electricity. And we all know that it will require more mining, as mentioned, because the energy transition is highly dependent on minerals. But also we will need more lines. And Hydro-Quebec project is to bring more clean electricity to one line to Massachusetts, and it's going through major obstacles. So this is an indication that even if we have high ambitions in terms of transiting to clean energy, it's not an easy story. It does not seem to be a straight line from one point to the other. This project in Massachusetts has been stalled for over a year now, and we still don't know if it's going to move ahead. So this is, again, a clear indication that if we want to transit, it will require major changes in our landscapes, be it more mining in our territories, more lines, etc. And I think that people should be more aware of that. And I've also written about this, that government should prepare people for these changes coming in our territories.
Well, we're coming to the end of the podcast, Yvan, and I just will maybe get you to offer some thoughts from a final passage I want to read from your book. The energy sector is called upon to experience major transformations, and these point to interesting possibilities important for Quebec. Why don't you talk about those interesting possibilities?
The energy transition is a transition to clean electricity, as I've mentioned, with more generation capacities and more lines in our landscapes. And the transition is heavily reliant on minerals for wind stations, electric vehicles, etc. Quebec already has a fully operational clean electricity system with low rates, strong mining capacities, a position in batteries technologies, high voltage transmission expertise. With its reservoirs, it can play the role as the battery of the Northeast in support for the penetration of intermittent power, solar and wind, and its generating stations can be operational very fast in 5 minutes if solar or wind stops providing energy in other jurisdictions. So it is well positioned to be a major player for the energy transition in the North American context. It has strong cards in its hands.
Well, great. I think it's time to say merci beaucoup, Yvan. Thank you for joining our program. It's really wonderful to get your perspectives and your thoughts about oil, gas, renewables, geography, Quebec, geopolitics, you name it. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our audience around the world for listening.
Yeah, thank you, Yvan.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate us on the app that you listen to and tell someone else about us.
For more ideas and insights, visit arcenergyinstitute.com.